Whatever he happened to have at the end of the day was given away. The kafir state attempts to systematize and orchestrate the distribution of wealth, to the annoyance of all except its ruling elite, who benefit from the manner in which that distribution operates. Whilst in a Muslim community, the distribution of wealth takes place naturally, spontaneously, and unexpectedly, to the delight of all who trust in Allah. The people in a Muslim community find their meaning in the worship of Allah. Allah says in the Quran, "I did not create man and jinn, except to glorify me." Allah also said on the lips of the Prophet Muhammad in a Hadith Qudsi, "I was a hidden treasure, and I wished to make myself known, so I created the universe." The knower, the known, and the knowledge are one. The people who are trapped in the kafir system, that is the Dajjal system, do not know this. They have been conditioned to find their meaning in the consumer-producer process, and to accept and submit to the system which enslaves them. It has already been stated that the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, is formed of interlinking systems. In order to understand how the interlink operates, it is necessary to look at some of the more influential systems more closely. It must be emphasized and remembered that it is the systems and structures which are being examined, and not necessarily the people in them. It often happens that people are born and brought up within the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, but they do not believe in it. Indeed, it is because of their direct experience of it that their understanding of its extent and nature is often more piercing and penetrating than that of those who have been born and brought up either in a simple community living in fitra or in a traditional Muslim community. The opposite is also true. A person born and brought up within a Muslim community may also end up rejecting it. Nothing in life is fixed. Everything is in change. See how many children born of kafir parents are embracing Islam, and see how many children born of Muslim parents are embracing kufr. Everything is in its opposite. It is an old cliché, but there is an element of truth in it. Whereas some people work in order to live, many now live in order to work. The kafir factory system is an inhuman and degrading system. It treats people as a necessary yet expendable part of the consumer-producer process. Increased automation means that the people who man the machines are increasingly subservient to the machines. They are obliged to keep pace with the machines. In a factory which produces 24 hours every day, the people have to be highly regulated in order to ensure that the machines do not have to be stopped and the flow of production obstructed. Births, marriages, and deaths tend to be viewed not as major events in a lifetime, but rather as potential inconveniences which threaten to disrupt the continuity of the production process. Any sense of job security is undermined by the practice of only offering short-term contracts and the threat of being replaced, thereby facilitating motivation through fear. The only way to survive in such an environment is either to act like a robot or to be one. Success in the factory system is measured by the degree of control which you exercise over others, and by the degree of control which is not exercised over you, and by the amount of money which you make in the process. The more products you can afford, the more successful you are. The more you embody the illusory ideal of the perfect consumer producer as depicted in the media, and there is more than one ideal in order to have as many profitable markets as possible, the greater is your reputation for success in the consumer producer game. In a kafir society, people are educated primarily in order to work, not in order to understand themselves or the nature of existence. The kafir educational establishments are themselves like factories, only the end product is not merely a product, but a person who will help to make products either directly by working in the factories, or indirectly by managing the factories, or by working in one of the interlinking subsystems, which ensure that the final product can be successfully advertised, distributed, sold, and consumed. Whether an individual is going to work in the public sector, or in the private sector, or in the services sector, the educational system ensures that he or she has been programmed to look at the world largely in terms of the cost of living. the number of unemployed, and the gross national product. The Kafir media system maintains this economic perspective in conjunction with the Kafir educational system. The only way to keep people enslaved in the consumer-producer system is to keep them in ignorance. Accordingly, they are given selected information during their so-called education, and by the media, and not real knowledge. They are conditioned to desire the bits of paper, and the know-how which will give them the best positions possible in the producer-consumer hierarchy. If the conditioning is not successful, it is almost inevitable that the Kafir legal system will be called into play in order to implant the basic ideal of the consumer-producer process more vigorously upon the person in question, the individual who has a good work record and a job waiting for him, or he or is usually dealt with more leniently in the courts of so-called justice. Some people are so impervious to the educational conditioning process that they end up spending a great deal of their lives in prison. The result is the same: an individual who has been rendered ineffective by means of institutionalization. The great majority of people who teach in the educational system do not have real knowledge, that is, knowledge of the real, that is Allah, or they would not allow themselves to be part of that system, and accordingly part of the producer-consumer process, which, as we have already seen, only appears to be an attractive proposition when Allah and the Last Day, and the fire and the garden are firmly forgotten. Furthermore, real knowledge is free. As soon as a fee is charged, you can be sure that you will only be receiving information for your money, most of it useless. Useful information is any information which leads to real knowledge. The opposite of that is useless information. Those who have real knowledge and share it do not charge money for it, because they know that it is not their knowledge to sell, and because they know that their knowledge is a gift from Allah, which has only been given to them because they wanted it and Allah wanted it, and not because they could pay for it. The only kind of payment which is necessary in order to acquire real knowledge is worship of Allah and fear of Allah, and having a good expectation of Allah. Ultimately, it is only given by the grace of Allah, if that is what Allah wants. You will not acquire this knowledge by seeking it, but only if you seek it will you acquire it. Allah says in the Quran, "Fear me, and I will give you knowledge, and remember me, and I will remember you, and ask, and I will answer." Allah is the rich, and not in need of what appears to be other than Him. AI that appears to be other than Him is in need of Allah. Allah is Al-Alim, the knowing, and Al-Kabir, the knower of every separate thing that befalls us. Ai Lati, the all-pervading. Allah gives knowledge to whom He pleases, and His outpouring is vast. The producer-consumer system is designed to stop you from finding out. The Kafir university system as we know it today, the apex of the educational conditioning system, is big business. It not only completes the conditioning process for those who are eventually going to be given control of the consumer-producer process and the systems which regulate and define its functions and make its existence possible, but it also ensures that a handsome profit is made whilst so doing. It also ensures that the future controllers of those countries, which have been successfully colonized by the originators of the consumer-producer process, can be suitably programmed to uphold that process and to protect the colonizers' interests. Long after these countries have been granted so-called independence and apparent release from the control of their former colonial masters, this conjuring trick, whereby the colonizers appear to relinquish control whilst in reality still retaining it, is sometimes called neocolonialism. 50 years ago, there were hardly any universities. Those which did exist had a relatively small number of students, whose primary objective was knowledge. Although admittedly these universities did cater primarily for the offspring of the then ruling elite, who were educated in order to take over control as and when their relatives died. As the new universities began to materialize, they at first retained the character and aims of the older universities, or at least tried to imitate them. Within 10 years of the end of the Second Kafir World War, however, a marked change in policy had become apparent. Whereas in the past the acquisition of knowledge, which is always a hopeless proposition anyway, in any institution whose teachers have no access to a living and intact prophetic guidance, had been the main consideration. Now, two fresh objectives emerged. The first objective was to expand as quickly as possible, so as to have as many fee-paying students as possible, despite the fact that this would mean that a close and meaningful relationship between the teacher and the taught would no longer be possible. The second objective was to channel more people into the sciences, and to lay less emphasis on the arts. Of course, these objectives were dressed up in suitable terminology, such as, everyone has a right to a decent education, and, in the interests of national safety and livelihood, research must go on. In reality, the so-called education was far from decent, whilst the very methodology used by these educational institutions often ensured that what was being searched for would not be found. Useless research is encouraged in the Ka-6R University because it keeps people busy and provides the fortunate few with an opportunity to build up a reputation and a sizable income out of nothing. What lay behind this change in policy, which clearly emerged after the end of the Second World War, was this: the power struggle which had been taking place behind the scenes for over 2 centuries, between the official Trinitarian Christian Church on one hand, and, on the other hand, those who were busy completing and building up on the foundations of the consumer-producer process as we know it today. The architects of the New World Order had been concluded. The bank was now more powerful than the church, the top financier more influential than the archbishop. The scientific movement had by now confirmed enough a booth nature of existence for anyone with any intellect to realize that the Christian metaphysic, whose basis was the untenable doctrine of Trinity, which had never even been mentioned by Jesus, peace be on him, and which had not been completely formulated until about 400 years after he had left the earth, was no more than a myth and no less than a lie. It is interesting to note in this context that, in contrast, what little knowledge the scientists have acquired through their methods of research is confirmed by what is in the Quran, which is, after all, the A to Z of existence, as revealed by the originator of all which appears to exist. The primary struggle, however, in this power struggle between the Christians and the scientists, was not between those who claimed to know the nature of existence, but disagreed with each other. It was between those who wanted power over the land and the people living in it. Thus, the real purpose behind the new educational policy was to ensure the uniform conditioning of as many people as possible. It was important that there was only one predominant version of the meaning of life available for public consumption, with only one predominant way of life to go with it. The fact that the Christian version could be scientifically disproved meant that the scientific version gained more credibility and acceptance. As a result, lifestyles began to change. Churches began to empty. Sports stadiums began to fill up. The means at their disposal, that is, a living and intact prophetic guidance to integrate that belief with the scientific fact with which they were now being presented. Thus, although the scientific version was clearly not the whole truth, it could not, on the face of it, be disputed, and in the meantime that magical word, research, could be invoked to show not only that whatever was not yet known was in the process of being discovered, but also that research was accordingly necessary to make these discoveries. It was on this basis that the scientists were able to provide answers to all the questions which the Christians could no longer avoid by railing people. This is a mystery. Or, this is not important as long as you have faith that the scientific version of existence, plagued as it is with speculation and theory, came to be widely accepted in the high-tech North. Whereas the Christians know that God exists, but cannot explain the nature of existence, the scientists have some inkling of the nature of existence, but cannot relate it to God. Once the scientific version of the nature of existence and the scientific approach to existence had become widely accepted, the people who championed this version and this approach inevitably gained control of the educational system. The research which they in fact encouraged was orientated largely towards the development of the producer-consumer system. This development depended on there being a uniform conditioning of as many people as possible. Only as a result of effective and widespread conditioning could overall control of the general population be ensured. It was necessary to imbue the people with the notion that the meaning of life was to be found in producing and consuming. As the numbers of students increased dramatically after the end of the Second World War, the people who taught at and controlled the universities changed. The old school either retired or died, and those who replaced them were either dedicated to the producer-consumer process and its ideals, or else they were free thinkers. Unaware of what that process was, and where its development was leading, the few who were aware of the change of approach to life which was being engineered by means of the so-called educational system, and who objected to it, could not afford to object too strenuously or to attempt to change the trend, as long as they wished to retain their position and its accompanying reputation and salary in the educational hierarchy. There was nothing they could do to change the system from within that system, and even less if they left it. The interlinking systems which together form the Kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, supported the educational system too effectively for anyone to be able to change it merely by opposing it. Severing a head or two from the many-headed beast does not kill the beast. Indeed, those who control the system encourage a certain amount of dissent, since it is easier to rule a people when they are divided against each other, and also those who are not easily placated by minor cosmetic changes to the system, which do not in fact disturb the status quo, usually end up exhausted and ineffective if they try to change the system single-handed. Of course, if too many people try to change the system together and look like succeeding, then they can usually be dealt with by means of the Kafir legal system. AI that is needed is a law making their group illegal, and then anyone who persists ends up in jail. In Algeria, for example, the banner of democracy was held up high until it became clear that the vast majority of the people were about to vote for a Muslim government, whereupon a military regime backed principally by France was hastily installed to protect the minority and to tyrannize the Muslims who had so nearly upset their former colonizers' political control mechanism by using democratic means. As the numbers of students at the universities increased, it became necessary to provide the buildings in which to house and teach them. The erection of these buildings, or the acquisition of buildings already standing, provided a good source of income for many people, and of course, helped to establish the producer-consumer process more firmly in the process. As the university system expanded, it took on the usual characteristics which typify the Kafir institution. Gradually, the university system, together with the substratum of polytechnics and colleges which had grown up below it, became increasingly impersonal and meaningless until it had become what it is today. Just another production line in the Kafir system, that is the Dajjal system. The relationship between the teacher and the taught was such, and the academic environment in which that relationship functioned was such, that the transmission of real knowledge, even if the teachers had had it in the first place, was an impossibility. The numbers were such and the systems were such, that the only transaction which could take place was the systematic and impersonal provision of vast quantities of structured information, of which was and is utterly useless. The better apparent a person was, the more clever he or she was considered. Wisdom was reduced to a word with a devalued meaning. The takeover, not only as far as the university system was concerned, but also the rest of the educational system, which prepared people for that university system, was completed, and continues to function today. Although life at university is usually depicted as a time of freedom and experimentation that first release from the restrictions of school and the parental nest, it is in fact highly structured and regulated, other than in the realm of private relationships and personal morality. Students at today's universities are encouraged to indulge in university politics and thereby to play a largely non-influential part in the running of the university. And woe betide any group of Muslim student who appear to be too well organized to work and to play so that they can let off steam while still submitting to their conditioning. And finally, to seek promising jobs in the consumer-producer process once they have been duly awarded their pieces of paper, which are commonly called degrees.